I call the Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This budget was written against the context of the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance having repeatedly said that New Zealand has a problem with total New Zealand indebtedness rather than government indebtedness, and against the background that said we needed to restructure the economy in order to have a fundamental shift in the economy. It fails. The budget document on page 70 describes the net international investment position, i.e. New Zealand's net debt, as a percentage of GDP. The forecast for this year ended 2011 is 78.6% of GDP, and having gone down a little over the last year. And for every year hereafter in the projections, New Zealand's net international position gets worse, i.e. New Zealand becomes more indebted as a nation year after year after year, not just in nominal terms but as a percentage of GDP. And it goes up from 78.6% at forecast for the 2011 year to 85.3% in the year ended 2015. That is an indictment on the government's policies. The other really bad figure in this is the current account deficit. The current account deficit pops into surplus of 0.5% this year, in part because of the monies coming to New Zealand from reinsurance overseas. Every year after this, we have a growing current account deficit as New Zealand gets poorer year by year, reflected in that debt position I just referred to. And the current account deficit for forecast for 2012 is 4.1%, rising to every year to 6.9% deficit in the year 2015. And the government pretends that they have maintained any one of their pre-election promises. Remember, they were going to close the wage gap with Australia, fail. They were going to lead us to a brighter future, fail. They were going to cause us a step change in the economy, fail. Mr Speaker, this budget lays bare the failure of the government's economic policy. Mr Speaker, we've heard from other contributions that they're going to go to the electorate for a mandate for their changes, including the sale of SOEs and cuts to the likes of KiwiSaver tax credit, and yet they count every one of them in the budget. Every one of them, of those measures, is counted in the budget, and yet this year we've got a $16.7 billion cash deficit, and we have deficits going into the future. And indeed, those debt figures that I said for the country are after the sale of the energy SOE interests and Air New Zealand interests. So those figures that I had as to total debt are after the family silver has been sold. Mr Speaker, David Cunliffe covered some of the effective tax increases that are in this budget for middle-income New Zealanders as a consequences of the change to KiwiSaver. And it's worth noting that the effect of this budget and the bill that we are now debating is to increase the tax burden of middle-income New Zealanders as a consequence of those changes. This same bill reinforces the cuts that were made to income tax rates by stating them again for the forthcoming year for the highest income groups. So the 10% of the population that got 42% of their income tax cuts, 42% of the income tax cuts in the last year's budget, keep them. The middle-income people who are on lower incomes than them get their KiwiSaver tax credits cut. Is that fair? No. Does it cause the economy to grow? No. We've had a much vaunted figure of 4-point-something% as being the growth outlook for the first year in their forecasts. That includes approximately 1.5% of money coming into the economy, mainly from overseas, as a consequence of the Christchurch earthquake and the insurance money that's being paid out of New Zealand coffers being spent in the Christchurch earthquake. You cut that out and the growth rate for New Zealand is a little over 2%. Mr Speaker, what New Zealand needs now is a credible plan to grow the economy. The government's had 3 years to do it. Their outlook is very poor, as shown by the fact that New Zealand's net debt position in the world gets worse. Even to get to that position, they've got asset sales, which is selling the family silver once. They cannot sell it again. They have broken their promises to New Zealand in many different ways. So, Mr. Speaker, I think that the figures that I would have reinforced to listeners are those debt figures that the Minister of Finance himself has been repeatedly emphasising as being the important figures, the net international debt position of New Zealand as a percentage of GDP, as a proxy for whether we are getting richer or poorer as a country, and that number gets worse every year from here on in. We go backwards. We heard the Prime Minister in his speech saying interest rates are going to be better than they would otherwise be. His own budget at page 70 shows the 90-day bill rate going up from 3% to 5% over the forecast period. A 3% to 5% increase in interest rates over the forecast period. So that's not quite as the Prime Minister would have people believe either. The other point that I find worrisome in this budget relates to the predictions as to tax revenue. The inland revenue and the Treasury can't agree as to how much tax revenue is going to be collected. And I read out what it says. Both sets of tax forecasts were based on the Treasury's economic forecast. So it's not related to economic forecast, but it says, using slightly different assumptions and forecasting models, inland revenue has produced a set of tax forecasts that are much lower than the Treasury's. Not just lower, much lower than the Treasury's. In this update, the total difference between the tax forecast across the 5 years is nearly $4 billion, a larger difference than is usually the case. The bulk of this is in corporate tax. So that's what they say. And then what do? Do they take the prudent course and use the lower of those figures because they've got it on the wrong side every one of their budgets so far? No. Do they average the two and take a mid-range figure? No. They take the irresponsible course in the face of a $16.7 billion deficit already. In order to protect those income tax cuts last year, 42% of which went to the top 10%, they take the irresponsible course of taking the highest figure because it suits their cause. They have taken the Treasury forecast, they have ignored the inland revenue forecast, they haven't even taken the midpoint, and as a consequence, even by this budget document, it is possible that these numbers over that 5-year period are $4 billion out. Not a trifling amount of money. I want to say something about what's heading to the education sector as a consequence to a change in this budget. At the moment, contributions to KiwiSaver for teachers, so teachers in KiwiSaver, the Crown contribution that matches the teacher contribution is paid out of government revenue. It comes out of government revenue via a vote that goes to state services. This budget changes that and says that effectively schools have to pay that themselves. So there's effectively a hole in the budget of every school because they have teachers who are entitled to be in KiwiSaver, whose matching contribution from the employer, which is going to go up from 2% to 3% next year, the government having reversed that from 4% to 2% last year, but the school now has to pay that 3% contribution to the teacher's superannuation. Where's that coming from? Where is that coming from? How does the magic work in the school's budget? I can't work that one out, and I don't think schools will be able to either. Can I say also that this pretends that KiwiSaver is getting better by going from 2% to 3%. Do people realise that the 3% that is coming from employers will have tax deducted from it before it hits the account? So the tax is deducted at the employee's tax rate before it hits the KiwiSaver account. So the 3% that comes from the employer, presumably at the cost of a future wage increase from the employee, and I'm not necessarily criticising all of that, some of that's unavoidable. I'm not saying that the employer can magic it, but the tax payment that's now going to be deducted from that 3% employee contribution effectively comes out of the employee's superannuation account. So not only are they being asked to sacrifice some of their wages, they're actually paying the tax on that 3% contribution. Mr. Speaker, this budget fails against the test that the government set for itself of leaving the economy substantially changed. That was their promise, and yet we see that the growth forecast is unchanged. New Zealand still sort of wobbles along at a pretty modest rate, and New Zealanders have to wait yet again for promises that there's just a golden day around the corner, which never seems to arrive under this government.